I am very grateful to be the chair of banking for New York State at the Senate level. I am very grateful that my chair at the Assembly level is also here, Assemblyman Pichardo, who is going to be a great chair of banking. We are, I'm among friends, Ellen Brown, McRae. These folk are actually people who trained me in this so many moons ago. And we never thought the day would come when we would be this close in New York State, the capital of banking. If the banking world has a capital, it is in New York City, and we are the Empire State. Never has the world needed a public bank more than it needs it now. We have just gone through two pandemics, the immediate one of COVID-19 and the longer term one of racial and economic inequalities. Both of these things call out for a new way of looking at money, a new way of looking at how do we use the people's money to do the people's good. Now, we're going to hear a lot of that this evening, and we have some of the greatest people on here. The president of the Public Bank of North Dakota is here. It's a joy to speak to you again, sir. You and your bank have inspired so many, whether we speak about the market meltdown of 2008, which you guys did not suffer, or we speak of the PPP fiasco, which you guys did not suffer. Now that's saying something, and we should learn from that. But greater minds than mine are going to speak on this, and I'm going to hand it to my colleague, our Assemblyman, our new chair of banking, Assemblyman Pichardo.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. Again, my name is Assemblymember Victor Pichardo. I have the honor of representing my neighbors in the West Bronx, and I'm looking forward to hearing, particularly from Mr. Hardmeyer and many people who are experts in this space, to understand how can it work here in the state of New York, how can it benefit my constituents, how can it benefit my neighbors, and how can we potentially move this economy forward and rethink how this economy can work in a post-COVID world here in New York State.
And I have Dr. Amara Enya, who will introduce our citizen presenters and lead us through the next part of the program.
Thank you so much. I want to definitely thank Senator Sanders for being here, as well as everyone who is joining us for this town hall, the Public Banking Institute for the tireless work that they've been doing on this issue for years, and for this moment that we're in that's really exciting because of the opportunities that it involves for really transformative change in our economy, much needed change, especially in light of everything that's happening with the pandemic and what a vision looks like for rebuilding our communities moving forward. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to co-moderate with the great senator and our distinguished guests. We have a presentation that will actually just do a little bit of background for everyone so that people who are tuned in can really understand what we mean when we're talking about a public bank and just get some foundational information. That presentation will be done by Victoria Alexander and Joseph Sackman and Madeline Chang. So they'll be doing this presentation, and then we'll launch into our conversation with President Hardmeyer of the Bank of North Dakota. So with that said, also I'm representing the Public Banking Institute as part of the advisory board for the Public Banking Institute. So it's a pleasure to be here. That said, I'd like to hand it over to our presenters for the slide presentation.
Hi, I'm Victoria Alexander from Dutchess County. I was a 2020 candidate for Congress, and I'm also Secretary of Ranked Choice New York and the Secretary of the Dutchess County Libertarian Party. Slide one, here we go. Bring on the power of public banking for New York. In this short presentation, we will first go over the problems that result from or can't be solved by private banking. And then we'll look at the solutions provided by public banking. We'll give a very brief history of some examples of public banking in the US. And then we'll end by imagining a better future for New York with a state bank. Slide 2, New York State is in trouble. Unemployment, business closings, increasing costs. Even before COVID, New York was in debt with high taxes, cutbacks in services, crumbling infrastructure, a shrinking population, and a pension obligation that we may not be able to meet. But this motivates us to change the way we've been financing projects using our tax money so that we can be more economically stable going forward and better able to handle the hard times. With 2020 hindsight, it's clear now that it's been a mistake to centralize and consolidate economic power. Since 2008, the US money stock has increased from about 7.5 trillion to over 19 trillion, with the steepest increase occurring since this March. But that money is not circulating around Main Street, where it could actually be used as a tool to increase production and services, to increase the wealth, health, and happiness of all New Yorkers. Our current banking system is not working for us. Next slide, please.
Huh? Sure.
Where do we find the money to start a bank?
What I'm doing.
We've lost revenue during the economic crisis caused by the lockdown. There are no CARES Act funds to make up for the revenue shortfalls. The state can even get cheap loans from the Federal Reserve, while the big banks and big corporations can. I'm afraid New York State will be forced to sell off some assets to private entities to avoid bankruptcy. But think about it, if private entities want to buy public utilities, that should indicate to us how valuable they are. A state bank can help us avoid privatization. We can hold on to our valuable public assets and make them work for us. Next slide. Banks don't have the problems that states have. Commercial banks can simply create the funds they want to lend for a profit, and they aren't under any obligation to look after the public good. That's an incredible amount of power that they have, and it has helped create the terrible economic disparity in the US and in New York. The US Treasury has been buying up the bad assets of the commercial banks. The banks keep the profits and socialize the losses. Under new 2020 rules, for-profit banks can borrow at the Fed's discount window at 0.25%. It's practically free. And they can turn around and charge struggling New Yorkers as much as 21% credit card interest. The Federal Reserve is loaning cheap money to the big commercial banks like crazy now that the requirement to keep 10% of funds on reserve has been eliminated. But as we said, that money's not going to Main Street. Clearly, this banking system is not set up to deal with a public crisis. It's the state that really needs cheap or free loans to get us out of this mess before irrevocable damage is done. Next slide. So we've defined some of the problems. Let's talk about solutions. Next slide. What is a public bank? Well, it's owned by the citizens, and a public bank must serve the public good. For example, in the little hamlet where I live in the Harlem Valley region, we don't have a public wastewater system, which means that we can't have many restaurants or a hair salon or a gym in town, which would attract other retail, which would attract more residents and get more tax revenue. Like many small towns and neighborhoods in big cities throughout the state, it's a little like a ghost town with beautiful old buildings going unused. I've served on the local wastewater committee. We have a high water table, rocky soil, many other constraints, which make a traditional sewer system very expensive. We paid for a number of feasibility studies, which tell us the obvious. Some businesses have already paid the tremendous expense of putting in on-site private systems, and they don't need or want a centralized system. It's been suggested that instead we could implement a much cheaper modular methane digesting system and work with local dairy farms to take their wastes. But loans for customized, non-traditional solutions are automatically considered risky. A wastewater system like this would be a win-win. The hamlet would attract business, we could help farmers and keep some of the dangerous methane from entering the atmosphere by using it to heat the town hall. Any wastewater system would eventually pay for itself, but the upfront costs are too much for our overtaxed citizens. And this is the same story throughout the state for all different kinds of infrastructure needs. A state bank could loan my hamlet the money at low interest, perhaps 1%. But commercial banks prefer to lend to those who don't really need the money. They tend to be biased against loaning to poor communities and minority neighborhoods, even though it's these communities that would make the most productive use of capital. Where does the money come from to fund a state bank? A public bank would hold the deposits of government like taxes and fees instead of putting that money in an account at a commercial bank. How much money does New York State currently have in commercial accounts? Consider every town, city, various government departments and agencies, even the state university system, which is the state's largest employer. Billions of dollars, I'd guess. Currently, these commercial banks are using a lot of that money to make low interest loans to multinational corporations or corporations outside the state. Meanwhile, these commercial banks use our money to make higher interest loans to our citizens, our businesses, and our cities. The state of New York has a lot of money that could be working for New York. Next slide, please. 25% of banks worldwide are publicly owned. I didn't know that earlier. This is not a new idea to think of banking as a public utility. China's bank creates the funds to build public infrastructure, and China is very infrastructure rich. But the US does not necessarily need to follow the specific examples of other countries. Our American vision would be banking for the people, by the people, local decision making. A state Bank of New York would be the opposite of the Great Reset solution that is being offered now, which would give even greater centralized control over credit creation. Next slide, please. Germany has a public bank network, a whopping 40% share of total banking assets. KfW is Germany's development bank, founded for reconstruction after the war. Germany's public banks have a directive to make loans to local businesses. Consequently, they have a strong small and mid-sized business economy. They have a strong export economy too, not because they have Fortune 500 corporations, but because they have many, many small businesses that make things to export. Economic diversity is more stable and robust, and I want that for New York State. Also, Germany handled the economic hardships associated with the lockdown much better than countries without a strong public bank network. Germany's COVID program was much simpler to navigate than ours. Also, our funds disappeared quickly, grabbed up by big companies. Our private banks are not in the business of serving the public good, it's just not their mission. In handling the PPP loans, they defaulted to their usual practice of serving big companies. Next slide. In 2018, the American Samoa Public Bank was chartered. California has passed legislation to allow a Los Angeles public bank to go forward. Currently, the US has one public bank. The Bank of North Dakota has been around for 100 years. It weathered the 2008 credit crisis just fine. North Dakota was the only state to avoid budget shortfalls. North Dakota had the nation's lowest unemployment rate and default rate. North Dakota has the most locally owned banks per capita. The Bank of North Dakota provides access to capital for small community banks, who in turn loan to businesses and people in the community. Next slide. Let's compare the return on equity of the Bank of North Dakota to those big finance firms. The Bank of North Dakota is more profitable, 70% more, and has a better credit rating than JP Morgan Chase or Goldman Sachs. Next slide. So why is a state bank so profitable for the people? Well, they don't pay shareholders. There are no bonuses or fees or commissions or high-paid CEOs, no advertising. Also, A state bank could leverage 10 times their revenues on deposit. So at least 1%. So even at 1% interest, that would be a lot of profit. A state bank isn't a retail bank, maintaining costly locations or ATMs. It partners with existing local nonprofit community banks and credit unions and loans them the capital to loan to local businesses. So public banks have very low operating expenses, which something around 13% compared to commercial banks, which I think Ellen mentioned once, which are nearly 60% overhead cost. These savings are passed on to you, taxpayers and the borrowers. Public banks are more efficient, more rational, and effective banking institutions. And now I will hand it over to Madeline Chang. Madeline?
Cut them off.
Hi, I'm Madeline Chang. I was a labor and community organizer for many years and a New York City public school teacher for 30. And now launching Voices for a New Democracy. I'm part of that effort to launch that blog. So there are other examples, successful models for the US government using public money for the public good. One of them is the Reconstruction Finance Corps, called the RFC for short. This was a lending agency that President Roosevelt used to fund the New Deal and World War II. What's important about this, I should say it issued bonds and loaned and invested over 40 billion. What's important is instead of taking out high interest loans from private banks to pay private corporations to build something like roads, for example, which we tend to do today, the RFC cut out the middlemen. And it was the government that created the money to loan and invest. And it was the government that put people back to work, building roads, bridges, post offices, about 3 million unemployed men and women, and the net profit to the government was over 690 million. So we have this precedent where the government became the biggest investor to the economy. It's like the economic power was essentially relocated from Wall Street to Washington, D.C. And we need Reconstruction again, just like in the Depression. We need to rebuild our economy, but we can actually do better than that by correcting past injustice. Black and brown communities have been hit by COVID, hit the hardest. And this is on top of all the inequality and disinvestment that private banks made worse over decades. And so public banking can help reverse the racial wealth gap by lending to Black and brown families, providing capital that historically has gone mostly to white families. The RFC this is an example of how we don't need to raise taxes. We don't need austerity, cuts to public transportation, cuts to education. We need public banking. So the next slide shows another successful model, postal banking, which we actually had from 1911 to 1967. We have 2 postal banking bills pending right now in Congress. The great thing about postal banking is the infrastructure is already there. We have 30,000 some post offices around the country. So postal banking is a perfect opportunity to serve the 25% of households that are unbanked or underbanked. People who can't afford to keep a balance or because there are no banks in the neighborhoods. And these households spend about $40,000 over a lifetime just on fees and up to 400% on payday loans. And Joe is going to talk about how this movement for public banking is growing next.
Thanks, Madeline. And again, my name is Joe Sackman. I am from Nassau County. I ran for state assembly last year, and I'm also a member of Long Island Activists and NYPAN, New York. Public banking is now a vibrant movement. For over 100 years, North Dakota has had a state bank, as we've learned. Now, California has passed legislation to allow for a public bank, and New Jersey's governor ran on creating a public bank. And New York, along with over a dozen other states, have introduced legislation to establish one, which is a big reason why we're here today. And that's thanks to forward-thinking leaders like Senator Sanders and Assembly Member Pichardo. I will tell myself next slide. All right, so why do we need a publicly owned bank? Having a public bank is going to give the state an advantage it doesn't currently have. For every dollar we have in a state bank, it allows us to lend 10. With the ability for the bank to borrow from the Fed at 0.25%, let that sink in, 0.25%, that means we're going to have access to inexpensive liquidity that during a crisis like COVID-19, we can use for emergency budget needs, like purchasing PPE, funding for schools, helping our small and local businesses to keep that local economy secure, and by being the banker's bank for community banks and credit unions. New York, like most states, works with private banks, and private banks answer to their shareholders, not the people. The people's money is best used when it's reinvested into communities. Why should the state spend millions or even billions in fees of interest when it could be using the money on schools, healthcare, and infrastructure? Also, the people's money should be in the hands of the people. A public bank would allow for local governance and control. You can read more about how New York will do that in the legislation that's being proposed by Senator Sanders and Pichardo. When we keep our money, the people's money, in a public bank, we're not going into debt to private institutions. For example, infrastructure projects can cost twice as much as when they're financed through private banks. If we're going to build a wind farm on Long Island, taxpayers will be very happy when we save billions because we funded it through a public bank. Same goes for the many infrastructure projects planned throughout New York. According to a report by Action Center for Race Equality, New York State would have saved around $6.5 billion in interest payments alone if there was a public bank in 2019. I don't know about you, but this sounds very fiscally responsible to me. Those billions could be invested in our communities, or we can just keep giving it away to private banks at the cost of the taxpayer. When a crisis hits like Superstorm Sandy or a pandemic like COVID-19, we don't have to wait for the federal government to decide whether it's going to send us help or if we're going to sue if it's just not enough. We also don't have to go begging private banks for loans, especially if they aren't willing to provide access to those loans. A public bank, like our friends in North Dakota have, can quickly have access to the funds we need to deal with the crisis. Like I mentioned earlier, quick, cheap liquidity, with the ability to lend out $10 for the one. We have the one that we have in the bank. So let's take care of its own financial needs. A public bank could be the support our local economy needs. We've seen friends and families suffering during this crisis. Our local small businesses closing up, friends losing their jobs, families losing their homes and going hungry. Personally, I've seen many families in need. I was out there during the pandemic, helping with mutual aid, helping deliver food directly to the families, talking with food pantries and community organizations that were scrambling to find enough food to help the many people that were coming to them. If New York had a public bank during this pandemic, it could have lent out the money to support local food banks. We could have had the help local small businesses needed through supporting community banks and credit unions, like our friends in North Dakota did with their PPP to companies' unemployment benefits. Could also have gone out faster to residents. How do we do this? Today's public banks, an overview. Borrow interest-free from the Fed and lend at 1 to 2%, direct credit where the community most needs it, support local businesses and create jobs, stimulate the local economy, restore the depleted tax base, and allow communities to declare their independence from Wall Street. As we can see, a public bank could do a lot of good here in New York. So how do we start one? We can start one through an emergency executive order in response to the pandemic. According to banking experts, the basic mechanism for a public bank could be set up in a couple of months. And then the bank can borrow from the Fed, as I said before, at 0.25%, provide that 10 times the bank's capital for credit below market rates to distressed communities, which we have plenty of, and work with community banks to fund loans for small and medium-sized businesses. So this is very doable. We know it's being done. We've seen North Dakota do it. So this is something that New York could definitely do. So how do you get involved? Tell your elected officials. Call your governor, state representatives, and city council. Tell them to support the efforts to set up the public bank by emergency executive order, or join with or start a local grassroots public banking group. Connect with the Public Banking Institute, who's here today with us, and hold the public banking town hall, which we're doing right now. Is that you can find out more about public banking, the Public Banking Institute, just to give a little shout out. And Ellen Brown, who's on the town hall with us, has written several books, which you can also check out. I recommend them.